Listen closely, because this is the moment nobody ever warned you about, the moment they never saw coming, and the moment you have been secretly waiting for. There comes a day, quiet, sudden, and heavy, when the avoidant finally realizes you were the one thing they thought they didn't need, until the silence taught them the truth. It doesn't happen while you're crying. It doesn't happen while you're begging. It doesn't even happen while they're pushing you away. It happens after you stop trying, when your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was, when the person who ran from love suddenly feels the gravity of what they lost. That's when everything inside them collapses. Not because you punished them, not because you tried to make them regret it, but because for the first time in their life, they felt the cost of their own walls. You didn't break them, their patterns did, and now they sit with the one feeling they spent their life avoiding: loss, real loss, unfiltered, uncontrolled, undeniable. Because the truth is this: you were never too much. They were simply too guarded to receive what you offered freely. And when the avoidant finally feels the weight of losing you, it hits with the force of everything they refuse to feel, all at once. They always think the breaking point happens in the heat of the moment, during the argument, during the tears, during the emotional chaos that feels like a storm about to rip everything apart. But that's not how avoidants unravel. That's not how their world collapses. They don't crack when everything is loud. They crack when everything becomes quiet. Silence is the moment that dismantles their emotional armor, not the conflict. The truth is, they have spent their entire lives believing that distance protects them, that withdrawing keeps them safe, that shutting down preserves their independence. And for a long time, this pattern works. It keeps people at arm's length. It keeps vulnerability away. It convinces them they're in control. You were never supposed to be the exception, but you were. You were the person who tried, who stayed, who showed up even when their walls told you to go. You gave reassurance when they offered distance. You brought warmth into a place that had been cold for years. And because you kept loving them through their silence, their detachment, their push and pull, they formed an unconscious belief that you would always be there, that no matter how far they pulled back, you would reach for them, that no matter how cold they became, you would bring the fire, that no matter how fractured the connection got, you would be the glue trying to hold everything together. They didn't notice it happening. Avoidants rarely do. They don't consciously tell themselves, I can take this person for granted. But slowly they begin to lean on your resilience. They begin to rely on your persistence. They begin to trust, ironically, that you will never stop trying. And that belief becomes their emotional safety net. They may not show it, but they depend on it. They depend on you loving them, even when they make it impossible. They depend on you staying, even when they're pushing you away. But something changes inside you long before the breaking point ever comes. It's subtle at first. You get tired of explaining yourself. You get tired of trying to connect with someone who doesn't know how to let you in. You get tired of feeling alone next to someone who claims to care. It's not a sudden explosion, it's erosion. A piece of you wears away every time they shut down, every time they pull back, every time they pretend your feelings are an inconvenience, every time you try to bridge the distance and they pretend not to notice the effort. And one day, without fanfare, without a meltdown, without loudness, you become quiet too. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity. You stop trying to decode mixed signals. You stop pouring your love into someone who has never learned how to receive it. There is no announcement, no final warning, no emotional ceremony. You simply stop trying because something inside you has finally snapped in a way that cannot be reversed. This is where the story turns. The avoidant has always measured your love by your effort. They've always equated your presence with your pursuit. They assumed your giving nature was infinite, that you had no threshold. But when you go quiet, genuinely quiet, not the I hope they chase me quiet, that's when their world starts spinning in a way they can't control. They don't understand it at first. They feel something is off but can't name it. Avoidants aren't used to identifying emotional shifts, especially in themselves. But they feel it. The absence of your energy creates an unfamiliar void. At first, they think it's temporary. They assume you'll bounce back, that you just need space, that you'll return to the version of you who always stepped forward no matter how far they withdrew. But then days pass, and you don't try. Then more days pass, and you still don't try. And suddenly they're confronted with something they have never had to experience before. The consequences of their own patterns. It's not your silence that destroys them. It's the meaning behind it. Your silence isn't punishment. It's clarity. And clarity is what avoidants fear most. Because clarity forces them to acknowledge that your effort wasn't guaranteed, that your presence wasn't permanent, that your love wasn't unconditional in the way they assumed. For the first time, they realized something heavy, something they spent years avoiding. You were the anchor. You were the stability. You were the emotional bridge they never built themselves. And with you gone, or even just emotionally checked out, they no longer have anything soft to lean on when their fears start whispering. The distance they once relied on now becomes the monster in the room. The independence they bragged about suddenly feels like isolation. The silence that once felt safe now becomes suffocating. They start thinking too much. They start remembering moments they didn't appreciate. They start replaying scenes where you were trying to connect and they were shutting down. They start noticing how they contributed to the fallout in ways they denied before. It doesn't hit all at once. It hits in waves. The first wave is confusion. The second is discomfort. The third is panic. The fourth is regret. And all of it begins with one truth they never imagined facing. You're not trying anymore. This is the moment the avoidant finally feels the weight, not during the conflict, but after it. Not when everything is loud, but when everything is quiet. Not when you're there, but when you're gone. Silence is the moment that breaks them. Not because silence hurts, but because silence exposes everything they never wanted to see. They never imagined you would outgrow the pain. In their mind, your love was a constant, unshakable force. Something that would stretch endlessly, something they could retreat from and return to whenever their comfort allowed. They misread your consistency as permanence, your loyalty as dependency, or emotional strength as emotional captivity. They believed you would always bend because you always did. They believed you would always forgive because you always had. And they believed you would always stay because you had never shown them anything else. Avoidants build their worldview around the single silent assumption: people leave when things get too close. So when someone like you comes along, someone who stays through their withdrawal, who doesn't run when they distance themselves, who doesn't collapse when they go cold, it creates a kind of emotional paradox inside them. You challenge their narrative simply by being consistent. And that's why they misinterpret your presence. They see it as proof that you will tolerate anything. They think your heart is unbreakable because you've survived everything they unintentionally put it through. But what they don't understand is this: your endurance wasn't infinite. It was hopeful. You weren't staying because you couldn't leave. You were staying because you believed they were worth fighting for. You believed their walls were wounds, not rejection. You believed that if you showed them steady love, they would eventually feel safe enough to reciprocate. You weren't naive, you were committed. And commitment is a powerful, dangerous thing when it's misunderstood. They didn't see the emotional labor you carried. They didn't see the internal conflict you battled every day, the part of you that wanted to stay versus the part that whispered you deserve better. They didn't see the nights you questioned your own worth because their distance made you feel like you were asking for too much. They only saw your return. They only saw your forgiveness. They only saw your resilience. Until the day came when your heart reached its natural limit. It didn't happen because you stopped caring. It happened because you finally started caring about yourself too. Growth doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, subtly. Like an inner shift you don't even notice at first. You begin craving peace more than connection. You begin choosing clarity over chaos. You begin valuing your own emotional safety over the fantasy of what this relationship could become. And suddenly the pain that once felt unbearable now feels like a teacher. The tears you cried now feel like evidence of your strength. The cycles you endured now feel like chapters you've outgrown. Healing doesn't need permission, and it doesn't wait for the avoidant to be ready. It begins the moment you finally see not who they could be, but who they chose to be. And that's the moment everything shifts. Avoidants assume that because your heart held on through their detachment, it will hold on forever. They assume that because you understood their patterns, you would always tolerate them. They assume that because you loved them deeply, you would love them endlessly. But when you start healing, they experience something they never prepared for, the loss of their emotional safety net. It starts with subtle changes they can't articulate. You don't respond the way you used to. You don't rush in to fix every misunderstanding. You don't offer reassurance at the slightest hint of tension. You don't try to decode their silence. You don't run toward them when they pull away. You stop chasing validation from someone who has never learned how to offer it. And that shift, that quiet, steady, self-respecting shift, terrifies them. For the first time, they see the cracks in their own logic. They realize your love wasn't proof of dependency. It was proof of your depth. They realize your presence wasn't guaranteed. It was a gift. They realize your effort wasn't automatic. It was intentional. And suddenly they start replaying moments they dismissed. All the times you tried to connect, all the times you asked for emotional closeness, all the times you reached out with vulnerability and they responded with distance. Avoidants don't expect consequences because their defenses have protected them from consequences their whole life. But your growth becomes the one consequence they cannot outrun. The emotional evolution you went through, the resilience you built, the clarity you gained, the strength you found, becomes the mirror they cannot avoid. They never imagined you would stop waiting for them. They never imagined you would stop being the one who tries. They never imagined you would look at the relationship and finally say, "This is hurting me more than it's helping me." In their mind, losing you was never a possibility. You were the stable one. You were the loyal one. You were the one who loved without conditions. But healing has a way of rewriting your entire identity. You begin to see that love shouldn't require you to abandon yourself. You begin to see that understanding someone shouldn't mean excusing their emotional absence. You begin to see that compassion shouldn't cost you your own well-being. And when you step into that understanding, you rise into a version of yourself the avoidant never expected to meet. They thought you would always stay small to keep the relationship alive. But you grew, you expanded, you awakened, and that awakening becomes the moment they realize their own actions created the outcome they never wanted. Because avoidants fear abandonment deeply, even when they cause it. And when they finally see that you didn't leave out of weakness, but out of strength, it shakes them in a way nothing else ever has. You outgrew the pain. You outgrew the cycle. You outgrew the version of yourself that kept giving without receiving. And that is the moment the avoidant finally understands they didn't lose you because you stopped loving them. They lost you because you finally started loving yourself. They never understood that your presence was their safe place. Not because you fixed them, not because you carried their emotional weight, but because you brought a warmth into their life they didn't know how to generate on their own. To an avoidant, closeness feels dangerous. Intimacy feels like exposure. Love feels like a risk they can't control. So when they first met you, with all your softness, your honesty, your emotional depth, it didn't register as safety, it registered as overwhelm. They didn't see your love as a gift, they saw it as something that demanded parts of themselves they had spent years hiding. They didn't pull away because you were wrong for them. They pulled away because you were right for them in a way they weren't ready to handle. Avoidants grow up learning a quiet kind of survival. Don't rely on anyone. Don't expect emotional comfort. Don't reveal too much. Don't let anyone get close enough to hurt you. They build independence like a fortress and then call it strength, even though it's really fear in disguise. And then someone like you enters their life. Someone who doesn't just knock on the door but gently shows them the possibility of what's on the other side. You didn't demand intimacy, you offered it. You didn't force closeness. You created the space for it. You didn't expose their fears. You soothed them without even knowing you were doing it, and that is what scared them the most. Because people who feel like home are the ones avoidants often push away first. Not because they want to lose them, but because home is the one feeling they've never known how to trust. Home means vulnerability. Home means letting someone see the parts of you that you don't understand yourself. Home means surrender. And surrender feels like danger to someone who built their identity on emotional independence. But the irony is this: the very thing they were running from was the thing their heart wanted the most. Your presence was the calm they never admitted they needed. You brought steadiness to the moments when their inner anxiety told them to detach. You brought reassurance when their old wounds whispered that love never lasts. You brought emotional clarity to a person who had survived by living in emotional fog. You didn't try to fix them. Your existence simply reminded them that connection doesn't have to be chaotic or consuming. You were the soft landing they never had in childhood, the gentle mirror that showed them a version of themselves they didn't know was possible, the emotional warmth they convinced themselves they didn't need until you were gone. And that's the part avoidants never recognize until it's too late. They think they're escaping pressure, but they're actually escaping comfort. They think they're running from expectations, but they're running from healing. They think distance keeps them safe, but it keeps them disconnected from the one person who truly saw them. When you were there, they confused your love with intensity because they didn't understand love without fear attached. When you listened, they saw it as interrogation. When you cared, they saw it as demand. When you wanted connection, they saw it as pressure. Their mind rewired your intentions into threats, not because of you, but because of their past. Avoidants aren't pushed away by love. They are pushed away by the feelings love awakens, the ones they don't know how to handle. But the moment you walk away, everything changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually in ways they can't articulate and don't expect. At first, they feel relief, the relief of not having to manage emotions that overwhelm them. But relief quickly turns into emptiness. Emptiness turns into restlessness. Restlessness turns into longing. And longing turns into realization. They begin to notice the absence of your energy in the smallest details. The conversations aren't as meaningful. The quiet moments aren't as peaceful. The world feels a little colder. Their home feels more like a hiding place than a sanctuary. Interactions with others feel shallow compared to what they had with you. And that's when the truth hits them with a force they never prepared for. You weren't the source of their overwhelm. You were the source of their grounding. You weren't the burden. You were the balance. You weren't asking for too much. You were giving them what they had never been given: consistency, care, emotional presence. The love you offered wasn't heavy. It was healing. They just didn't know how to recognize healing when they saw it. Your presence made them feel safe in a way they couldn't articulate. Safe enough to feel, safe enough to think, safe enough to imagine a life beyond their walls, a life they both craved and feared. And that contradiction tore them apart internally. So instead of leaning into the safety, they leaned into the familiar distance. Avoidants run toward what hurts and away from what helps, simply because pain is predictable and love is not. It isn't until you're gone that they finally see the truth their fear kept hidden. You weren't another person trying to take something from them. You were the one person who brought something into their life they had always been missing. Your absence exposes the very safety they never acknowledged when they had it. And suddenly the thing they once feared, intimacy, becomes the thing they silently crave. But by then, everything feels different. Not because you changed overnight, but because they finally see what your love actually was and what their fear cost them. Regret doesn't arrive for an avoidant in one dramatic moment. It doesn't explode. It sneaks in quietly, the same way their detachment used to creep in on you. They don't wake up one morning, slam their hand on the table, and shout, "I messed up." No. Their regret comes in waves and flashes and haunting little moments that slowly accumulate until the truth becomes undeniable. Avoidants are experts at suppressing emotion, but loss is the one emotion that refuses to stay buried. It begins subtly, almost imperceptibly. They notice a small thing first. Maybe it's a song you used to play, or a phrase you used to say, or a joke only you two understood. It doesn't hurt them at this stage. It just creates a flicker of awareness, a soft reminder, a mild discomfort, something that feels like a shadow passing across their chest. They brush it off. They tell themselves it's nothing. They distract themselves because distraction has always been their survival mechanism. But the mind remembers what the heart avoids, and the body remembers what the mind denies. So the waves begin. The second wave is a sense of restlessness. Nothing feels quite right. Their routine feels off. Their sleep feels shallow. Conversations with other people feel empty. The world feels flatter than it used to. They can't pinpoint why, so they blame stress, work, timing. But deep down, something in them knows the emotional anchor you brought into their life is missing. They used to run from your closeness, but now they feel the hollow space where your presence used to be. Then comes the third wave, the one that cracks their internal narrative. Because avoidants build their identity around the belief that they don't need anyone. Losing you doesn't just hurt them emotionally, it disrupts the entire story they've been telling themselves since childhood. Suddenly they're questioning things they never questioned before. Why did I push away the one person who actually cared? Was I afraid, or was I wrong? Did I mistake safety for pressure? Did I mistake love for threat? Why isn't this emptiness going away? These questions become louder than the defenses they used to hide behind. Their mind becomes a battlefield they can't silence. And then comes the fourth wave. Memories. Not the neutral ones, not the easy ones, but the moments where you stood by them when they were difficult to love. They remember how patient you were when they shut down. They remember how you tried to understand what they didn't know how to explain. They remember how gently you held their vulnerabilities, even when they pretended they didn't have any. They remember the times you reached for them emotionally when they couldn't reach back. They remember how you softened during conflict instead of escalating it. And that's when the guilt begins. Avoidants are often painted as cold or uncaring, but the truth is much more complicated. They feel guilt more intensely than they allow themselves to admit. They just don't have the tools to process it. So the guilt doesn't make them reach out immediately. It makes them freeze. It makes them isolate even more. It makes them spiral inward. They replay the moments where you were hurting because of their emotional distance. They replay the times they dismissed you, minimized you, or made you feel unimportant. They replay the look on your face when you realized you weren't being met halfway. And the most painful realization of all, you never asked for too much. You asked for the bare minimum. Affection, consistency, communication, and they couldn't give it. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. And now that you're gone, they finally understand the price of not learning how. This is when the waves turn into storms. The late-night thoughts they used to push aside become louder. The emotions they used to avoid start rising to the surface. The longing they suppressed starts turning into regret. The silence they used to crave becomes unbearable. Avoidants don't miss people the way others do. They miss the space people held in their life. They miss the version of themselves they were when that person was around. They miss the emotional environment that person created. And you created an environment of stability, warmth, and emotional safety, something they didn't value until it was gone. They begin noticing how different everything feels without you. Their home is quieter in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. Their routine is emptier in a way that doesn't feel freeing. Their interactions are duller in a way that doesn't feel comforting. Regret grows strongest in the places where you used to add meaning, and suddenly every part of their life starts reminding them of the one thing they pushed away. This is where the deepest wave hits, the one that leaves them breathless. It's not longing, it's not nostalgia, it's not fear, it's the realization that you were good for them, that your love brought out a version of them they secretly admired but never felt worthy of being, that the connection they ran from was the connection they actually needed. And that realization is painful in a way avoidants are not emotionally equipped to handle. They don't know how to reach out authentically. They don't know how to communicate regret. They don't know how to say, I'm sorry I hurt you, even when every fiber of their being is screaming it inside. So they suffer in silence. They pretend they're fine while carrying a regret that grows heavier with time. They try to move forward but keep circling back emotionally. They try to forget you but keep remembering you. Because the truth is simple. You weren't just someone they lost. You were someone they never learned how to keep. And that is the kind of regret that lingers. Not for days, not for months, but for years, sometimes longer than they will ever admit. Your healing was never supposed to be the turning point, not in their eyes, not in their mind, not in the narrative they had quietly built about you. Avoidants assume the story always revolves around their fear, their distance, their internal battles. They assume you will remain in orbit around their emotional avoidance. They imagine you waiting, understanding, holding space, staying loyal, and never reaching the moment where you choose yourself. They never anticipated your transformation. They never expected you to rise. They never imagined you could outgrow the version of yourself who once tolerated their emotional absence. But healing changes the entire storyline because healing rewrites who you are at the deepest level. Healing doesn't roar. It whispers. It begins in the quiet moments when you're tired of feeling unseen. It begins the day you realize peace feels better than potential. It begins when you stop romanticizing someone's wounds more than your own worth. Your healing wasn't about them. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a way to make them regret losing you. Your healing was a conversation between you and your soul, a conversation where you finally admitted what you needed. And once you began healing, the entire dynamic shifted, not because you forced it, but because growth naturally pulls you in a different direction than pain. At first, your healing looks like small changes they don't notice. You respond slower. You ask fewer questions. You stop trying to analyze their mixed signals. You stop offering emotional explanations just to keep the peace. You stop walking on eggshells around their discomfort. Then your healing becomes visible. You speak more calmly. You draw clearer boundaries. You say no without guilt. You prioritize your peace. You choose environments and people who reciprocate your energy. And that's when something inside the avoidant shifts. Because the moment you begin treating yourself with value is the moment they finally see the value they took for granted. It shakes them. Avoidants aren't used to losing people who love deeply. They're used to people chasing them, accommodating them, fighting for them. But when someone like you heals, you stop fighting for closeness with a person who doesn't know how to meet you there. You stop pleading for connection. You stop shrinking yourself to make the relationship work. You stop interpreting crumbs as a feast. Your healing transforms the energy you bring into the world. You move differently, you speak differently, you choose differently, you love differently, starting with yourself. This is where the avoidant begins to feel the shift in a way they can't articulate. They sense your detachment, but not the resentful kind, a peaceful kind. And peaceful detachment is the one thing they have no defense against. They were prepared for your anger. They were prepared for your tears. They were prepared for your fights. They were never prepared for your peace. Your peace says, I no longer need what hurts me. Your peace says, I release what doesn't reciprocate. Your peace says, I choose myself. This is when the avoidant finally recognizes the truth they avoided. They didn't lose someone who needed them. They lost someone who grew beyond their ability to connect. Your healing exposes the dynamic they tried to ignore. While they remained stagnant, you evolved. While they repeated old patterns, you outgrew them. While they clung to avoidance, you learned emotional courage. While they hid from love, you expanded your capacity for it. And nothing destabilizes an avoidant more than witnessing someone they pushed away rise into a stronger, wiser, more grounded version of themselves. Because deep down, avoidants do not fear love. They fear being unprepared for it. They fear not knowing how to keep someone who deserves more than their default behaviors. They fear being the reason for someone's heartbreak. They fear that one day someone will walk away not because they don't care, but because the avoidant couldn't step up. That day becomes real when you heal. Your transformation forces them to confront their inaction. Your strength highlights their emotional immaturity. Your growth puts a spotlight on the stagnation they clung to. And your ability to move on proves something they never wanted to face. They had the chance. They had your loyalty. They had your presence. They had your patience. They had your love, and they squandered it because they didn't know how to appreciate it. Your healing becomes their awakening. Because healing is the ultimate mirror, not for you, but for them. It reflects back everything they failed to nurture, everything they avoided feeling, everything they could have built but didn't. It shows them the difference between what love looks like when it is given with fear versus what love looks like when it is given with intention. And that realization lingers. It lingers when they see you smiling again. It lingers when they see you becoming emotionally healthier. It lingers when they see you attracting people who treat you the way you deserved all along. It lingers when they see you no longer waiting for something they never learned how to give. Your story was never supposed to revolve around their fear. Your healing turns it into a story of your strength. Your healing shifts the narrative from why wasn't I enough for them to why was I settling for so little? Your healing breaks the cycle. Your healing rewrites the ending. And when the avoidant finally feels the gravity of losing you, they realize something they never expected. Your healing didn't take you away from them. Their avoidance did. Thank you, truly, for walking with me through this journey, for your time, your presence, your heart, and your willingness to feel deeply even when it wasn't easy. Every moment you chose to listen, every second you chose to stay, every emotion you allowed yourself to experience, it mattered more than you know. But this is the part where our paths separate. Not out of anger, not out of bitterness, and not out of defeat, but out of growth. So here it is, wrapped in honesty and peace. Thank you for what you brought into my life. Thank you for the lessons. Thank you for the memories. Thank you for the moments that shaped me. Thank you for helping me understand what I want and what I can no longer accept. And now, goodbye. Not the dramatic kind, not the painful kind, just the kind that comes from clarity, healing, and strength. Goodbye to what hurt. Goodbye to what was uncertain. Goodbye to the version of me that kept waiting. Goodbye to the story that held me back more than it held me together. I leave with gratitude. I leave with peace. I leave with the knowledge that what's meant for me will meet me without fear, without hesitation, without running. So thank you and goodbye. May we both grow in the ways we never did together.